and welcome to this discussion on the future of encryption. Today, we intend to discuss the use of encryption as a tool for securing digital information and online communication. Specifically, we will discuss the proposals for weakening encryption for law enforcement and national security purposes. Now, encryption is a cryptographic tool used to ensure the safety of data stored on electronic devices like laptops and mobile phones, and also to secure the confidentiality of online communications. Social media platforms like WhatsApp and Signal use a specific kind of encryption, end-to-end encryption, to secure messages on their platforms. Now, the outcome of this technology is that the transmitted data cannot be accessed by a third party, and therefore cannot be altered or intercepted either. The use of encryption has now become problematic, at least in the perception of law enforcement agencies and national security officials, for a significant period of time. But encryption has become an important policy issue again in the last few years, in part due to the acceptance of platforms that use end-to-end encryption. Now, the use of encrypted platforms by malicious actors has become a problem, and this has been seen in many cases in India as well, but also globally. For example, terrorists involved in the 26/11 attacks in Mumbai were said to be using encrypted communication devices to avoid interception by Indian security agencies. Similarly, those involved in proliferating child sexual abuse material often do so online over encrypted platforms. Law enforcement agencies face difficulties with encrypted information because of the anonymity and confidentiality provided by encryption. They face three specific kinds of problems. One, they are unable to trace and authenticate the identities of communicating parties. Two, they are unable to carry out real-time monitoring and wiretapping. And three, they are unable to avoid being detected by people under surveillance while they're trying to access their communications. To overcome these issues, many different solutions have been proposed, and some of them involve regulating the strength of encryption. Others involve creating technical measures to access encrypted data. This is also sometimes called a backdoor or an exceptional access measure. And another set of proposals aims to create alternatives to weakening encryption by relying on metadata or non-content data. India itself has introduced measures that are a variant of this. Earlier this year, we introduced a traceability requirement. This requires social media companies to trace the originators of certain content on their encrypted platforms and provide this information to the government. However, each of these proposals has been met with criticism on the grounds of technical feasibility and on the grounds that this would significantly weaken the use of encryption in online communication. So for today's discussion, we will focus on the feasibility of these proposals and how well they're suited to meeting the objectives stated by security and law enforcement agencies. For this, I'm joined by a panel of experts in the field. Marshall Erwin is the Chief Security Officer at Mozilla. He is responsible for cybersecurity policy, encryption, government hacking, and vulnerability disclosure. Mallory Knodel is the Chief Technology Officer for the Center for Democracy and Technology. She is the chair of the Human Rights Protocol Consideration Group of the Internet Research Task Force and an advisor to the Freedom for Online Coalition on Emerging Technologies and Cybersecurity. Mr. Yashovardhan Azad is Chairman, DeepStrat, and former Special Director, Intelligence Bureau. He has a wide variety of experience in national security and governance. He belongs to the 1976 batch of the Indian Police Service and served as the police chief of 4 districts and the deputy of a range before moving to the Joint Intelligence Committee. And lastly, Mr. Udbhav Tiwari is a non-resident scholar at Carnegie, India. He is a public policy advisor for Mozilla, where he primarily focuses on data governance, content regulation, and connectivity in the Asia-Pacific region and beyond. I'd like to welcome all the speakers for this discussion, and we'll begin with brief comments by each speaker, followed by an open discussion moderated by me. We'll then address some questions from the audience in the last 10 minutes. So I'd like to begin by requesting Udbhav to make some opening remarks. Udbhav, over to you.
Thank you so much, Anirudh, and thank you so much for having me here as well. I think that in terms of the general thematic developments that have taken place in the field of encryption, you've broadly covered the high-level sort of categories of the sort of technical measures that various governments are trying to propose, but I thought that we could sort of condense them probably into 4 broad themes. Firstly, just to give the audience an overview of what some of these ideas mean, and then I could also maybe share my thoughts on some of those ideas as well. The 4 themes, broadly speaking, I would say are, firstly, intermediary liability and duty of care, which is this idea that governments are starting to impose limitations on when online platforms can enjoy safe harbor on the internet if they deploy encrypted services. We've seen, for example, the traceability mandate that is present in India, while is a technical measure, and we'll get to that a little later. Its foundational basis is still very much a safe harbor debate, where the government has made the ability for end-to-end encrypted platforms to enjoy safe harbor on the internet contingent on them deploying encryption in a particular format. We saw similarly worrying proposals with the Earn It Act in the United States, and also in the online safety law that is being debated in the United Kingdom. In general, we're trying to make encryption and linking it to the duty of care that platforms have to carry out, especially when it comes to safe harbor, is, I personally think, at least a pretty worrying concern, largely because of the fact that it forces platforms to make choices between the privacy and the security of their users, or the ability to either be held liable or not liable for the content that is propagated on their platforms. It's a pretty blunt instrument in general, and so far in the different places in the world that we have seen it deployed, for example, both in India as well as in Brazil, it's already been challenged in court, and it's arguably one of the harshest ways to ensure that some of the larger technology platforms don't enjoy safe harbor anymore because of the fact that they deploy encryption, and it's one that I think should be looked at very carefully and pushed back against whenever possible. The second broader theme would definitely be exceptional access or backdoors. Laws such as Australia's TOLA law, as well as the data retention law that Belgium is considering, are examples of laws that, rather than necessarily going after encryption directly or going after safe harbor, generally just tend to simply say that certain data, regardless of whether encryption is deployed or not, must be made available to law enforcement agencies, which is the case of Belgium. Whereas the TOLA law in Australia is a lot more specific, and says that platforms must, in the sort of highest category of requests that can be issued under the law, deliberately engineer weaknesses into their systems in order to comply with government access requests. There's already been some great work that's been done by Internet Society that demonstrates that even independent of the very scary privacy concerns and cybersecurity concerns that this would raise, that such laws are also quite bad for the economic potential of a country. And the Internet Society's report that came out late last year actually talks about this in fairly comprehensive detail, and some of the approximation that they have done goes into the hundreds of millions of Australian dollars just for one country. And then client-side scanning mandates, which is something that we have now increasingly started seeing some governments talk about, but also companies like Apple talk about, are also probably an interesting third theme to talk about in terms of developments. There's a lot of, I would say, technical sort of uncertainty in some circles and a fair bit of certainty in the other, that says that client-side scanning mandates, even when it comes to the scanning of CSAM content or even otherwise content that may be considered problematic, such as terrorist content, create far more problems than they really solve practically on the ground, and the technology required to deploy them in a feasible manner is something that simply doesn't exist right now. We've seen some industry players take a pretty strong stand on this front, such as WhatsApp, but we've also seen some companies like Apple sort of backtrack a little bit from some of their more ambitious proposals and delay it until there's a little more technical certainty. And there are many experts on this panel who I think will be able to talk about that. And finally, I think the last theme, and the theme that's actually quite important in the context of India, is traceability. The idea that, especially when it comes to mis and disinformation, finding out the originator of a piece of content will help government not just sort of investigate those crimes, but also deter future actors from carrying that, is one that sounds very enticing, but there is quite broad technical consensus that it is currently impossible to deploy traceability right now without significantly either weakening end-to-end encryption or allowing large-scale one-to-one matching of every single piece of content that is shared on a particular piece of platform. And this is something that civil society organizations and academic experts alike have even testified before in the court in India, and WhatsApp has also filed a case against the Indian government in the Delhi High Court to talk about and push back on this very specific proposal, which in fact no other company has done for any of the other provisions in the intermediary liability rules, which I think is just a sign of how problematic some of these things can be. So I think the common theme in a lot of these things is that it's a lot of old ideas that have been around in the encryption space for quite some time, but being rehashed either to account for some technological advances or the fact that there seems to be a concentration of power in the hands of certain companies in the sector now as comparison to maybe a decade or two ago. But the overall stand that one needs to take, that encryption should be inviolable and it should not be possible to weaken encryption on the basis of government sort of mandate, I think is as important, if not more now, as it was when the encryption, also so-called crypto wars, really started off. So yeah, those are my introductory remarks. Back to you.
Thank you, Udbhav. And I'll next move on to Marshall. And Marshall, would you agree with this characterization that Udbhav has laid out of these four broad kinds of measures that are being deployed or at least being considered, and the kinds of risks that Udbhav talked about?
Yeah, I think Udbhav has done an awesome job at kind of laying out the technical solutions, the technical and policy solution space that I think is under consideration today. So I think that framework is really helpful for the discussion. Maybe what I'd like to do is kind of take a little bit of a step back and provide some context for those solutions and why they are coming up right now. I think might be helpful. We are now on, it's probably decade 3 of the encryption debate. It seems like this just continues to go on and on, but actually this is actually a unique moment in time for this debate, which feels like it's shifted in a really perceptible way. And that's in part because a growing concern and interest in content and the problematic content that is on the web today. I think there is, in our view, in Mozilla's view, an appropriate desire from regulators across the globe to more effectively regulate big tech. Frankly, there's also a growing and again appropriate concern about various types of malicious content on the web and what we're going to do about that. I'll come back around to give some thoughts about what Mozilla actually thinks we should do about that. But I think that is motivating a general interest in this solution space and having these sort of secondary knock-on effects on the encryption debate. In our view, an exceptional access regime is fundamentally a bad idea, whether you're sort of trying to facilitate a particular law enforcement investigation or trying to explore solutions globally to content, one way or the other. But those concerns about content, malicious content on the web today, are quite serious, and like I said, are changing the dynamics in this debate in a fundamental way, which is why we're now seeing this exploration of these solutions that Udbhav laid out. It's interesting right now in the sense that I think encryption is less under threat in the United States right now, in part because of the way I think US policymakers are thinking about content. Less interest right now in thinking about sort of systemic monitoring for content, for example, not really on the table for solutions for these content issues in the United States. More interest in the United States in thinking about kind of things like amplification systems, what we can do to sort of turn down the velocity of information, some of the stuff that Frances Haugen has highlighted and has really focused the policy debate in the United States in a helpful way. And I don't think that has quite shaped the international debate quite as much yet. And I'm hoping it can drive the solution space on some of these content issues more in that direction and less in the direction of sort of systemic content monitoring, which is a bad idea in a number of respects. The other fundamental issue in the United States is we've seen these major cybersecurity incidents recently, which I think have really focused everyone's attention on the fact that our internal house isn't in order on cybersecurity issues, and we really need to sort of whole of government, whole of society effort to address these systemic cybersecurity problems, and that means being in favor of strong encryption, which is a quite positive development. But again, if we compare that alternatively to sort of how this debate is unfolding elsewhere, where there's, I think, a little bit less of a precise understanding of the cybersecurity benefits of encryption and a growing desire to attack these content issues directly in a regulatory framework. The debate has really moved globally in a problematic way. I think you see this most precisely in the UK, where this sort of conflation of content and encryption issues is most problematic, and we are seeing proposals being put on the table that are, well, quite horrible, sort of best in class horrible in the UK. And we see that elsewhere as well with things like TOLA. And so that's going to be an area where Mozilla is going to be particularly active I think, over the next few years. Said we do take these concerns about content very seriously, and the solutions that we want to see put in place focus much more on questions about what's the right regulatory regime for recommendation systems, for example, or amplification systems, algorithms, less focused on breaking encryption to monitor the content, which is fundamentally a bad idea for a number of reasons.
Okay, that's very interesting. And I'd like to take some of this and also pose it as a sort of question to Mr. Azad, who I'll come to next. And if you could specifically talk about this encryption issue from the perspective of a law enforcement agency or a national security agency, talk about this idea of content becoming more and more important and critical as something that law enforcement agencies need to access. And the other part which came out implicitly in Marshall's comments was also that there is a question of state capabilities and state capacity involved, because like you mentioned, the US has not been this vociferous in its demand for weakening encryption, partly because it also has other tools at its disposal to actually access some of this content. So do countries like India actually demand a weakening of encryption systems, also partly because it's a state capability, state capacity issue? Mr. Azad.
Thank you very much for having me here, Anirudh. I think you've laid down the broad parameters very, very well about the concerns of the law enforcement agencies. Let me say that the encryption debate today, as Mallory rightly said, that this is the third decade and it seems to be frozen in time. And I'm of course, very happy if United States is making positive overtures towards keeping the sanctity of encryption intact. Though I had a different impression that the intelligence agencies, the FBI, is very, very keen to have its own way. And in fact, it had a running battle with Apple, as you remember, in a particular case. But nevertheless, let me say that since 9/11, the entire world scenario has changed in terms of terrorism. And in terms of the view of the law enforcement agencies, it is now extremely difficult to sort of thread out the various coalitions in the terrorism world because of the sleeper cells, because of the international linkages, because of the vast amount of money which is coming from different areas, whether it's through even bitcoins. So the paradigm has completely changed. And that is why intelligence agencies all over the world are pressurizing the governments that, enabling law should be there, that we are able to access the content. Now, what has happened in India is that you have seen, in fact, after 9/11, a series of incidents took place in the first half of 2000 decade, 21st century decade, a series of issues. And a lot of networks were involved. I don't want to go into the details of it. And even as late as, if you're talking about the people, the potential candidates who were joining the ISIS, and who had gone even to Afghanistan and other places, they were using all these platforms, unusual platforms, Threema and Signal and Telegram and things like that. And that's why the intelligence agents was alarmed and they wanted something. And they said that the last mile connectivity can only be gained by the content. And in the process, of course, there was a humongous amount of metadata which was being collected, but metadata takes you until this place, and beyond that is the content, which is very important. I'll make very quick, this was my first point, and I'll make 4 very, very quick other points. And that's why if you see our International Technology Act, which was 2000, and when the rules were made, there were some special considerations. And what were those special considerations? The problems we have, communal problem. It's a very serious problem in India. Rumor mongering of the kind is very, very difficult. Look at the agitation which took place 26 January, the farmers' agitation, when about 250 Twitter handles had to be disabled coming from there. Twitter was, of course, open, but there were the WhatsApp chats and things like that. And the most serious, as referred to some time back, was the CSAM, the child pornography, which has been busted by the CBI of late. And this was on a series of WhatsApp chats. So these are the burning problems faced with which the intelligence agencies are asking access. Now, I'm not saying personally I'm in favor of it, that you should weaken encryption. My third point is that technology, of course, has its limitations. I mean, we are in this debate right from the Clippers chip we were talking about in the 90s to having backdoors, and what happened in Greece, we all know. And to the point today, when the intelligence agencies are virtually screaming that we are not able to get to this lead, and this has to be prevented. And to prevent this, we need access. Now, given the nature of technology we have, and like he mentioned I'm not an expert of so many ways. If it were ideally possible, like the electronic world of eavesdropping, if it could also happen in the digital world, that without breaking the friction, without weakening, it could happen, nothing like it. But the fourth point which I'm coming to is that in India, after the Puttaswamy judgment, which says that privacy is a fundamental right, then it goes against the very grain of privacy. So how are you talking about traceability origin when it kind of breaks the sanctity of the information and the freedom of sharing information? And there are about 40 crores users of WhatsApp and other platforms. So these are very serious issues. And the last point which I want to mention is, which you forgot to mention, that apart from being a cop, I was also the Central Information Commissioner. So I have seen the other side of it. And when we are talking about transparency and accountability, I mean, ultimately it comes to the debate in a democracy. How you can curb your fundamental rights in the name of state security? Now, that is a question which a democratic world has to think into very, very seriously, given the technology, given the broad parameters, given the constraints. And therefore, I feel the one last point which I would like to make is that, of course, it's a question of state capacity. Of course, it's a question of LEA's capability to analyze the metadata. For example, in US, recently, the way metadata was used brilliantly to catch those culprits on Capitol Hill is an example to the whole world how metadata can be better analyzed. And therefore, lastly, I would say, there has to be a better cooperation, intelligence sharing between the law information countries all over the world, enforcement agencies. And also, there has to be more sensitization of the LEA and more cooperation of the LEA with the top corporate giants, so that we are able to develop capacities and capabilities and get through these issues. Thanks.
Thank you, and very, very interesting and valuable insights. And one of the points that you rightly mentioned is that there is also a need for international cooperation on some of these, and even on existing mechanisms like data access, we need to relook mechanisms to actually improve capabilities so that some of the demand for access to encrypted information can actually be channeled into these mechanisms. So let me now move on to Mallory to respond to some of these points, but also to present her own perspective of having worked at the forefront of some of these issues. Mallory?
Thanks. Yeah, I want to touch on a few things that have been said already, but I'll do it in my own way to get to the point where I think we all agree that more security is generally better. So I'll start by saying that for me, the distinction between the two of the three approaches that you mentioned in the very beginning, to create a backdoor or to come at this problem from issues of metadata and so on, that is to me the same. I don't take a reductionist approach to end-to-end encrypted systems that are only about decrypting a previously encrypted piece of content. We have to look at the whole system. And so any attempt to weaken it, to me, is what effectively we've been calling a backdoor. At the same time, I think that is because what law enforcement and intelligence community agencies are asking for isn't just a backdoor. It is no longer a simple request to decrypt a piece of content. They're asking, and these have been mentioned before, they're asking for tech-assisted tools to aid in investigations, to make sure that content is properly time-stamped and traceable so that it can be court admissible. There are some calls then to make sure that crimes can be prevented, that content can be prevented from sharing, that we discover new and novel crimes being committed before they are actually reported. This is not a simple request. And so we can't take a reductionist view on what is or isn't a backdoor, what does or doesn't break encryption. It's all game. And we see that in the two documents that I've worked on in the past couple of years. The first one was in response to a leaked document from the European Commission. It was a small working group that laid out a variety of different scenarios, technical proposals for how to break end-to-end encryption. And they included, again, it's a technical paper. So it's talking about client-side scanning. It's talking about maybe, cryptographic computation, a variety of things like that. The point, though, at the end is that none of these really are going to be sufficient to keep communications infrastructure safe and secure, because one change to a platform will have a ripple effect for all users. One database of hashed content that is objectionable puts all content potentially at risk because the technology in that backdoor is now introduced. It also has a ripple effect across the industry. So if one government is successful at attacking one company, then a lot of companies will feel compelled, a lot of governments will feel empowered. And that is something that we simply can't allow for. So it's really important then that just to look at maybe what are viable. So I will maybe be a bit more generous than I usually am about what's possible. So another paper I worked on was around content moderation. So it's not specifically talking about the law enforcement case, but because it's been mentioned, I think it's relevant. It also sets a baseline for what we can reasonably expect platforms to do in the interest of users that may then also have an effect on investigations and law enforcement. And those two things that I think out of all the different proposals out there that would be promising are things like user reporting. So this is a user empowerment feature that also solves the problem of unwanted content, contacts, that sort of thing. That, though, does need additional research, because I do believe that when you look at the use case of law enforcement getting access to data, user reporting can sometimes be creating more data about sensitive communication. So say that I have been solicited pictures or contact that was unwanted. I actually want to flag that to the platform so that I don't see it and so that I'm not associated with it anymore, because to me, I objected to it and I don't want it. The problem with a user reporting feature that would capture that and try to mitigate it or try to reduce that proliferation could be that it actually does associate me with the content going forward. And if law enforcement were to request that content, there would be more metadata available for law enforcement and it would include me. So it gives me some concerns with deniability and anonymity when we create user reporting features. Another one we've talked about a lot is metadata. We also felt that that might be something promising, considering metadata is used for a whole system security approach generally. It's used against spam, it's used against just abusive platforms, and it could also be used to maybe do content moderation. But there are, of course, concerns with that. We don't want platforms to feel like they have to create more metadata, right? We don't want to proliferate metadata in an effort to do better content moderation. And we also want to note that if in the case of law enforcement access to metadata, there should be a warrant required for that. We've seen there has been a court case in the US that ruled on that. And as it's noted, it was really brilliant used in the riots, but this is court admissible. We want to make sure that even access to something that the server, that the platform has, such as metadata, can't just be freely accessed through a PIN register or other kinds of persistent access mechanisms. You need a court order or something stronger. I will end, because I think my time is up, by just echoing what's already been said. As far as governments, security agencies, law enforcement, intelligence community, they need to invest in security as infrastructure. There needs to be a baseline set around boundaries beyond which we won't go. If we can agree that we won't try to mess with end-to-end encryption, I think a lot can be done. actually to build on top of that, to give users an appropriate level of security and confidence in their communications that are both privacy respecting and confidential, and then try to solve some of these other problems that are social problems, content problems in a different way. And then I think that companies should actually not be sort of waiting to see if governments will compel them to make these changes, but actively trying to reduce the amount of metadata that they already have in their end-to-end encrypted systems, introducing features like anonymity, deniability, other things that feel like add-on enhancements to end-encrypted environments because of this issue of, increased court orders and things like that. So the other thing that I think companies can feel confident in taking that approach is that we have mechanisms like the Global Encryption Coalition that are comprised of, small companies, of medium-sized companies, of civil society organizations around the world that are looking at these policies and watching them. So hopefully together, we can continue to be here maybe for another 20 years talking about how to strengthen end-to-end encryption. I'll be here if you all will. Thanks.
That's great, and thank you for that. And I think it opens up the debate for my first follow-up question to both you, but also to Marshall, Udbhav, and Mr. Azad, which is so far a common theme that has come from all of your comments, but also what we are actually seeing is basically governments making a series of demands about what they want from companies in terms of access to content, as opposed to an earlier debate about the Clipper chip technology, where the government actually played a proactive role in proposing alternative or a way out, which was problematic on its own. But the distinction between what happened then and now is important, because what we are seeing right now is more of a demand rather than a proactive proposal coming from the state. So if you were to take a larger perspective on it, do you think this is a better approach than for the government to actually think about what technological solutions are appropriate? Or do you think it's actually better for the state to weigh in and say, look, this is the kind of mechanism we think would work, and let's have a debate about the specifics of implementing that solution? We could start with Mallory and then go on to Udbhav and Marshall and Mr. Azad.
I like to think of the framing as technical solutions to aid in law enforcement and intelligence community, rather than the insight, the more specific, let's look at solutions to end-to-end encryption. I think that it will give us better answers over time. It also takes the pressure off end-to-end encryption. I don't think that there's been a strong enough case, given the risks to human rights. We could hear from journalists and human rights defenders all over the world about how important this is. People who can't access content without it, things like that. There's not been a strong enough case made for why this specific action must be taken by some of the biggest companies in the world. And I agree with Marshall that we need to regulate big tech better, but I also think we need to reach as many people as possible with good, secure technology. So that would be my response, but I'm really looking forward to what others think as well.
Yeah, and I think I'd also like to chip in by saying that when I was thinking about the government talking about a specific solution, I was thinking about the Indian government and its traceability mandate, which in one sense is a slightly more specific articulation of what their concerns are, because they're trying to narrow down the scope of information that they're requesting rather than creating a larger demand for weakening encryption. In that context, is it better for states to actually articulate more specifically what their demands are from the point of view of technology, or is it better to just place a demand and let companies figure it out? But Marshall?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, this sort of shift in the debate that you're highlighting. Someone mentioned the Clipper chip earlier. Sort of, let's go like decade 2 of this discussion really did have the government much more sort of in the weeds proposing actual technical solutions. And I think there's both a strategic and tactical reason that we've shifted away from that. I think that largely the government, at least again, the US government, in my engagement with them, feels like that sort of set them up to put forward proposals that would easily be shot down, right? And so as a result, I think, frankly, like Mozilla, companies like us, we are actually much better at designing technical solutions than the government. So there's some reasonable approach there that says like, the government is not the appropriate body to design and put forward the technical solutions. I think that's a fair shift in the debate. At the same time, the challenge with that shift, again, like my experience with this largely in engaging with US policymakers, US law enforcement, and national security, the challenge with that is that it has allowed, it at least allowed US law enforcement, US national security officials to kind of divorce themselves from the practicalities of the risks of the solutions they wanted to see in place. And so what you would see, for example, this was kind of the standard approach from Director Comey, was to say, I'm not an engineer, I don't know what the solution is, but I know you guys can do it. So we'll establish the mandate and you guys go forth and create the solution because you're great at solutioning. And that, I think, really didn't result in a mature level of discussion, even within US national security and law enforcement bodies, about like, what's the risk we're really asking companies to take or create by these solutions. And I don't, so again, like the idea that that companies would be the parties designing the technical solutions, I think is probably right, but that has to be informed by a smarter understanding of within law enforcement and national security agencies about like the relative risks of those solutions and what the underlying effect is going to be.
If I could just add to that, because I think that I 100% agree with Marshall that the solution has to be very informed because of potential future knock-on effects. But I think also we need to be very upfront about where it's coming from a technical perspective. So like in the case of traceability, I think the workflow very obviously includes all like existing possession of the content. A law enforcement agent gets a message, the message is objectionable, they want to know where it comes from. So it's not like we are somehow only going after metadata, right? Which is kind of the narrative. It's like, we're only asking to know where a message came from. We're not trying to break encryption. But in fact, you have then. The sort of overall context does include the content of the message. And then at the end of the day, what law enforcement has is the content of the message and everyone who's seen it. So it's actually quite a lot more than just metadata. And so sometimes I think without discussion about the exact technical proposals that are on offer, those kinds of nuances get missed. And we're sort of asked to, gloss over some really important key contextual information.
Can I bring Mr. Azad in to respond to some of this? Is the traceability requirement supposed to or intended to work like this? Or is the idea that law enforcement agencies come into possession of certain information, which they, in one sense, they already have some objectionable content, and then they're trying to trace backwards as to what caused it to proliferate? Is that the intention behind this mandate, or is it supposed to work out more in the way Mallory is suggesting that it will? So you're on mute. Mr. Azad, you're on mute. Could you unmute your speaker? Yeah.
Am I audible now?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Now, there are two issues here. One is, of course, that the law enforcement agencies or the intelligence agencies come across a content which is surfaced, and they want to trace it because it's very, very important for them to see how it has developed and who's the main man behind it, because a repetition of these incidents do take place. The other thing which I want to say is that the context of the situation in South Asian countries may be a little difficult, with serious fault lines in the social fabric. There are many issues which lead to an instant conflagration. So it's also prevention. Now, it's one of the very important points which was made earlier was the investment in security technologies, and I agree with that. There has to be a greater sensitization of the law enforcement agencies, and there has to be a greater investment in the challenges of for example, analyzing the metadata. But the question is, in certain cases, when it's a very serious event like this, which actually impinges on national security, then the traceability part comes in. Now, the government, of course, does not have the capability, I would say, in that respect, to develop that kind of a technology or to suggest a solution of that kind. It depends on the tech people, and that's why I said it depends a lot on the cooperation. And I have said that the encryption debate is frozen because this is where we are for the last so many decades. I'm glad if US is understanding the issue, but Australia is not. In UK, things are different. In European countries also, things are different. And in India also, it's not that the enforcement agencies want breaking of the encryption. They want some information. And if that information is available without breakage, it's perfect. So that is where the dilemma lies. And I think we need a lot of cooperation to go further in this.
Udbhav, two requests from you. One, could you weigh in on this? But the other is, could we also move to the next part of the discussion quickly, which is to try and understand these four broad characterizations that you laid out and that Marshall added to. If we were to think of these in terms of the feasibility of their deployment or their actual use, how would you actually think about the relative risks of each of them?
I mean, I think just to weigh in on the conversation so far, I think everything worth saying has certainly already been covered, but I just add that it definitely highlights the importance of technical consensus, right? I think in proposals such as the traceability proposal in India, what we've actually seen are so-called multiple technical truths. You have one set of equally credible experts claiming one thing, another set of equally credible experts claiming one thing, and like equally credible in the eyes of the government and in the eyes of courts, right? And I think like this is something that everyone in a way touched at, on the importance of why it's not just enough to give demand for outcomes and then say you come up with a technology solution. You have to understand the technology when you have that conversation for it to be constructive and for the outcome to be worthwhile. But there's, I think, an equal onus arguably on industry, on academic researchers, and on civil society to just make sure that it's much harder to claim some of the things that were claimed in the traceability debate in India. And this is so much so from a like very elementary like cryptography and mathematics to at an even higher level, just what the general understanding of the issue and what is feasible and what is not is. I think there are some countries and jurisdictions in the world where this is a bigger issue, some in which it's not. And there are some solutions such as like technical access that completely bypass them, right? Like technical access, exceptional access, measures such as the TOLA law don't really care about whether it's technically feasible or not. They just actually want you to do it. So, but apart from that, almost all of the other themes rely in a way on the government understanding what is feasible and what is not feasible. And the current approach of sort of cherry picking your expert who will claim one thing that like the vast majority of experts, and especially ones outside the country and internationally, can like very easily rebut is not exactly a very constructive, it doesn't set a constructive tone, and it leads to like, I'm not very sure whether we want a Supreme Court judge, like choosing between two technical models of traceability and saying this is the model that we are now going to follow. Like there is no world in which I think that like that will end in a good way. So just that point on the first bit. On the second bit, with regard to the feasibility of the various measures, I mean, I think that in terms of the risks that they create, I think the most problematic one are definitely like exceptional access mandates, right? Like they are, all four of them are problematic, but exceptional access mandates essentially negate the very idea of encryption. They are, I think, increasingly falling out of fashion all over the world. Like there are some laws like TOLA, and the UK has the Investigatory Powers Act that creates the legal framework for them to happen. But the amount of times, for example, those such requests have actually been made under those laws, at least from publicly available information, is quite low, and definitely not as high as one would imagine it being if they were actually being effective. So it's clear maybe some like companies and organizations are pushing back. Civil society is also really talking about the problem. But In terms of the bad outcome, that I would certainly say, at least in my opinion, ranks as number one. In terms of things that like, it's definitely nothing is worth compromising the idea of encryption to allow for them to operate. If I had to place a second one, it would definitely be the intermediary liability and the safe harbor sort of duty of care approaches. And the primary reason behind that is that if there is a way to coerce platforms to do something, A is of course pass a law that says you need to do it, and if you don't, we will find you or send your employees to jail. But the second is really to start making them liable for the content that's on those platforms. So if, for example, I were a government and I wore a completely different hat and I really wanted to enforce that exceptional access mandate, I would probably tie it to the liability provisions too, because if you're liable for the content, then it doesn't just become a thing of protecting your users and privacy and security, but it then becomes about active like liability being placed upon your company and its services for certain actions. And we've started to see that in India. And I think that's the reason WhatsApp chose to like file that case in the Delhi High Court in India as well, because it understood the consequences of that liability really being imposed. After that, like I would like between the other sort of proposals, I think the risks to them are pretty clear, but they all largely point towards the lack of technical consensus angle, where I like, this is not to say that there is insufficient technical consensus among credible experts that those are bad ideas and will not work. I mean that there is insufficient consensus within the government as to which set of experts it should choose to follow. And that consensus, both between governments as well as within governments, is something that's actually pretty important, because it can set a baseline for at least what is and is not feasible for future conversation.
Thanks, Udbhav. Marshall, first, could you address that? And I also had a follow-up question from you, which is it a useful way to think about this in terms of data at rest and data in motion, or trying to break encryption on communication platforms versus trying to break encryption on devices? Is that a useful way to think about the relative risks of each?
Yeah, so first to like tackle the previous question, I think Udbhav's right about kind of thinking about this exceptional access and then the liability approach. But frankly, like technically they're the same. It's just the liability approach is actually a clever way of requiring an exceptional access mandate without actually explicitly saying it, but it's actually, the solution is actually the same. I do want to say a little bit more about the client-side scanning idea, one of Udbhav's four that he laid out, because I think it's interesting in the sense that like, I think technically it's actually the hardest. And I'm not a technical expert on it, but I'm pretty skeptical that the solutions are super viable, and even in terms of like delivering what law enforcement is asking for here. At the same time, I think there's actually another unique challenge to these client-side scanning proposals, which is that it fundamentally changes the nature of your relationship between you and your device. You can no longer trust what is actually running or operating on your device, on your desktop browser or your phone. And we make, like Mozilla, we make a web browser. We collect data from that browser. We have sort of some means to remotely collect data, but fundamentally, we try to make the browser something that users can trust. They don't have to trust Mozilla, you can trust the browser. And that's, I think, the same fundamental relationship that people should have between them and their operating system, them and their phone. And when at the point at which you have a client-side scanning mechanism, it means that you can no longer trust this thing that is so integral into your life. And I think that's a unique element of that solution space that I find pretty problematic. Introduces kind of a very separate set of risks than these exceptional access proposals, which I think are problematic, but don't fundamentally shift the relationship between you and the device in your pocket. So your question about data in transit and data in rest. So I actually do think that is a good way to think about the problem, and it's for this reason. Fundamentally, the systems that encrypt data in transit are ones that we rely on every day. We are using it now when I talk to you over Zoom, right? These systems are just integrated into like almost every moment of your life, and it's very complex. And what we see is this very complex interaction when you're communicating in real time, and that means that any solution in that space is also going to be more complex is going to be more systemic and introduces more risk. That's not to say that solutions to data at rest on your device are a good idea, but it does mean that those solutions might be less complex and therefore might introduce less risk than, for example, an exceptional access regime that governs data in transit or your communications, which is fundamentally an even worse idea than an exceptional access regime that governs sort of data at rest on your phone, for example, which is, again, in our view, also a bad idea. But again, because the systems there are slightly less complex, it would introduce a little bit less risk than mandates governing data in transit. I'd be interested in Mallory's opinion on both of these questions. I think I heard her comment earlier to say doesn't like the reductionist view that kind of forces us to weigh some of these balancing. So I would be interested in her perspective on some of these issues.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page. I mean, another way of saying what you just said about the data at rest versus in transit is that it simplifies things for the user. It complicates things for law enforcement. So having to get hold of a device, having to hook it up to a supercomputer in order to break it is complicated for law enforcement, but that is effectively what we expect in a democracy. We expect the bar to be high to be able to, balance, right, the rights, the human rights and user rights, and the rule of law. And so that is, I think, an appropriate displacement. So having these capabilities over a network is just too much access because it will affect every single user, every single application, and that is far too permissive, far too permissive, because a lot of these proposals around the world, like the UK and the EU, they're saying, they don't think that big tech and its platforms should come between a court, a court's decision to get access. Like nothing should be warrant proof, they say, or systems should not deliberately design. That is a quote from the Five Eyes plus Japan and India. Platforms should not deliberately design systems to forgo any access whatsoever. But I think the problem is that isn't always going to be what happens. I mean, sure, there could be a government warrant or a court order to get access, but the capability is persistent. It's a persistent threat to any user, whether or not it's used or not. And we know from a variety of cases that have become public that law enforcement and intelligence communities don't often go through courts to get what they want, especially when they're trying to work on investigations. They have a job to do, right? They're looking to uncover crimes. Sometimes it's going to make sense to go through a court so that evidence is admissible. That is certainly the right way to do things, but that's not always how it's done. I mean, CDT just relatedly put out a report on data brokers. FBI goes to data brokers before it goes to a court to get data because it's just simply easier. So if we had this capability on our phones, on our computers, it would just be, I think, too tempting and too permissive. And not all regimes are terribly democratic. And not all democratic regimes will always be democratic, right? So we have to make sure that we have hardened systems with strong encryption, strong security, that users can trust in to conduct the daily business of their lives, beyond which they have trust that the devices they're using, the user agents on those devices are actually acting in their behalf and they aren't turned against them. So I would certainly agree that client-side scanning is a really bad idea, because also, even if you narrow it technically to only worry, in the Apple case, right, only worrying about certain kinds of content that are hashed in a database, only certain applications. I mean, Apple has not just iMessage, not just iCloud, they run a whole operating system. It would be incredibly tempting from a design architecture perspective to put that capability in the operating system and then make it available to potentially other platforms and apps that might also want to implement some version of that, and then making that sort of modular, group of libraries or group of capabilities that the system could call. And then you have essentially ubiquitous, right? We don't want that sort of scope creep. And it would be so very tempting from a technical perspective to do that, and really quite trivial. So please, let's not. It's just too permissive, too dangerous.
Great. And we are almost out of time. We have, I think, 4 or 5 minutes left. So I'll just bring Mr. Azad in for his comments on this. And I'd also like to ask him, do you think something like breaking encryption on devices actually responds to the imperatives that the Indian law enforcement agencies seem to be responding to, which is to prevent proliferation of fake news, which is to try and find the originators of malicious contents? Do you think it's a reasonable proposition for them to be told that, why don't you think about breaking encryption on devices rather than going after communication platforms?
Well, let me say at the very outset that we understand the problems of getting backdoors or breaking encryption. See, that is why I'm saying that the encryption debate, even after 3 decades, remains still there. Ultimately, in the end, there are 2 questions remaining, which are very, very important for the law enforcement agencies. And I would say not only for the law enforcement agencies, it is also for the countries and the society at large. First, even more important than terrorism is child pornography. Child pornography over the years, if you see the reports and the crime figures, is increasing day by day. The criminals who are involved, the most important part of it is that they are first timers. So if you're talking about upgradation in investment of security, no matter what you do, the first timers are creating the biggest problems, whether it's on the terrorism scene or whether in terms of child pornography. So the child pornography is very important and is going through freely on these encrypted platforms. And secondly, the terrorism sleeper cells, which is the real threat to the modern world, is also continuing. What do you do about that? Yes, it is the responsibility of the law enforcement agencies, but then it is also society which is affected. It is also people who are getting killed. And child pornography perhaps is the biggest danger today to the world. As in the recent thing where hundreds of people across the world, they were caught. So this is where the debate lies. What do we do? If we have a solution from technology, nothing like it, who's going to do it? And as Udbhav very rightly said in the beginning, that somebody has to take the responsibility, and also the corporate guys do have a responsibility. So that is where the debate lies, and we have to see what we can do about it. Yes, greater intelligence sharing, greater metadata analysis, a greater cooperation between the tech giants and the law enforcement agents. This is what we can do in the meantime.
Thank you for that. And unfortunately, we've run out of time, and we've not been able to reach a workable solution to this decade-long problem in this short hour. But it's been a great discussion, and I'd like to thank all the speakers for this. Thank you for taking the time out, and I hope the viewers enjoy this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.